Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales. Before we delve into a saga of fire, blood, and a daughter's undying promise, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. Ring the bell, too, so you never miss a story from the untamed heart of the American West. Now, pour a drink, find a comfortable chair, and prepare for the legend of the Outlaw's daughter, a woman who declared war on the United States Cavalry itself. The world of Outlaw Vance was forged in the crucible of the Cimarron Badlands, a jagged, sun-scorched territory that spat on the laws of men and maps. For the first 16 years of her life, her only church was the vast, star-dusted sky, her only school the whispered lessons of survival from the hard men who rode with her father. Her father was Silas Vance, a name that carried the weight of legend. To the Pinkertons and the U.S. Marshals, he was a plague-wheel robber of payrolls, the ghost of the canyons, an outlaw of notorious repute. But to Alara, he was simply father. He was the man who taught her to read the story of the land in a broken twig, the man whose calloused hands could gently braid her wild, raven-black hair, the man whose laughter was a low, rumbling thunder that promised safety in their hidden sanctuary, a high-walled canyon they called Vance's Folly. Vance's Folly was a community of ghosts, a haven for men who had been crossed off the map of respectable society. They were outlaws, yes, but they were also Alara's uncles, her protectors, her tutors. There was Grizz, a mountain of a man with a beard like rusted barbed wire, who taught her the soul of a firearm, not as a tool of murder, but as an extension of the will. A gun ain't got a conscience, alley girl, he'd rumble, his voice thick with whiskey and wisdom. That's your job. There was Coda, a silent Apache tracker whose blood was mixed with that of the white men he'd come to despise, who taught her to move without sound, to read the wind, and to understand the secret language of the animals. From these men, Alara learned not the courtesies of the East, but the hard, practical truths of a world that would kill you for a moment's weakness. Her father, however, was her true teacher. He was a man of contradictions. He could plan a train robbery with the meticulous detail of a general planning a battle, yet he would spend hours with her by a fire, reading from a battered copy of Shakespeare he'd liberated from a wealthy passenger. Words are the sharpest weapons of all, Alara, he'd say, his finger tracing the text. They can build a kingdom or start a war. He was raising her not to be an outlaw, but to be a survivor, a queen in a kingdom of rock and dust. He was a flawed, dangerous man, but his love for his daughter was the one pure and complicated thing in his life. It was a love that would, in the end, be his undoing. The shadow that fell upon them was long and blue, the color of a U.S. Cavalry uniform. For months, a new commander at the territorial fort, a man of iron reputation named Captain Marcus Thorne, had made the capture of Silas Vance his personal crusade. Thorne was a new breed of soldier, a man who saw the West not as a land of freedom, but as a chaotic mess to be tamed and brought to heel under the singular, unbending rule of federal law. He was methodical, relentless, and utterly without sentiment. He used informants, new telegraph lines, and disciplined patrols to slowly, methodically, tighten a noose around the Cimarron. The betrayal came from within. A young, desperate rider in Vance's gang, captured and facing the gallows, traded the location of Vance's Folly for his life. The attack came at dawn. Alara was awakened not by the gentle song of the canyon wren, but by the sharp, terrifying crack of a Spencer rifle. The sound was alien in their sanctuary, a profane intrusion. She scrambled from her bedroll, her heart hammering against her ribs. Outside, chaos had erupted. Blue-coated soldiers were swarming down the canyon walls, their movements coordinated, their fire disciplined and deadly. They were not the clumsy posses the gang was used to. This was the army. Silas Vance and his men, caught completely by surprise, fought back with the desperate fury of cornered wolves. The canyon, once a place of peace, became a symphony of health roar of rifles, the scream of ricocheting bullets, the shouts of dying men. Alara, her mind numb with shock, was grabbed by Grizz, who shoved her toward a hidden crevice in the rock face, a secret escape route only a few of them knew. "Go," he roared, his face grim, firing his big Colt revolver over her head. "Your father's orders. Now, Alara, go." But she couldn't. She was frozen, her eyes searching for her father. She saw him then, not in his usual position of command, but out in the open, using his body to shield the path to her escape route, throwing the soldier's fire to himself. He was fighting not to win, but to buy her time. His twin revolvers bucked in his hands, a whirlwind of controlled violence, but he was one man against a company. And then she saw Captain Thorne. He was mounted on a magnificent bay horse, aloof from the chaos of the firefight, directing his men with cold, precise hand signals. He saw Silas, and a grim smile touched his lips. He dismounted, pulling a gleaming rifle from his saddle. He took his time, resting the barrel on a rock, aiming with an unnerving calm. Laura saw the glint of the sun on the rifle barrel. A scream tore from her throat. "Father!" Silas turned his head at the sound of her voice, his eyes finding hers for a fraction of a second. In that last, fleeting moment, she saw not fear, but a look of profound, heartbreaking love and a silent command to live. The rifle cracked. The sound was impossibly loud, a thunderclap that split the world in two. Silas was thrown backward as if by a giant, invisible hand, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. He fell to the dust, his revolver slipping from his grasp. The world went silent for Alara. The gunshots, the screams had all faded into a dull roar. She saw only her father, lying broken in the red dust. Captain Thorne walked calmly over to the body, his boots leaving crisp prints in the blood-soaked earth. He nudged Silas with his foot, then holstered his pistol and looked up, his cold, gray eyes scanning the canyon. For a moment, his gaze seemed to lock directly onto the crevice where Alara was hiding, and she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. He hadn't just killed an outlaw, he had executed a man, and he had done so with the detached efficiency of a butcher. The firefight dwindled and died. Most of Vance's gang were dead or captured. The sanctuary was broken. Grizz, bleeding from a wound in his arm, finally managed to drag the catatonic Alara into the narrow passage, pulling her away from the scene of her father's murder, away from the smoking ruins of her entire world. They traveled for days through the hidden, forgotten paths of the Badlands, Grizz and the Apache tracker Coda, the only other two to escape the massacre. Alara did not speak. She did not eat. She did not weep. She was a ghost, a hollowed-out shell of a girl, her mind trapped in a perpetual loop, replaying the image of her father falling, of Captain Thorne's cruel, impassive face. On the third night, as they huddled by a small, smokeless fire, the dam of her grief finally broke. It was not a storm of tears, but a single, terrible, dry sob that seemed to be ripped from the depths of her soul. She looked at Grizz, her young face aged 100 years, her eyes no longer the eyes of a girl, but the hard, flinty eyes of something ancient and unforgiving. "His name," she said, her voice a raw, broken whisper. "The officer. What was his name?" Grizz looked at her, and in her gaze, he saw not a child in need of comfort, but the birth of a terrible, unshakable purpose. "Thorne," he said, his own voice heavy with sorrow and foreboding. "Captain Marcus Thorne." Alara nodded slowly, the name branding itself onto her soul. She looked into the dying embers of the fire, and in their faint, red glow, she made a vow. It was a silent promise, spoken not with words, but with the absolute certainty of a heart that had been shattered and reforged in the fires of loss. She would not mourn her father with tears. She would mourn him with blood. She would hunt down Captain Thorne and every man who rode with him that day. She would become a ghost, a whisper of vengeance on the wind. She was no longer just Alara Vance. She was a living monument to her father's memory, and she would not rest until she had repaid his death, bullet for bullet, even if she had to burn down the entire U.S. Cavalry to do it. The 10 years that followed the massacre at Vance's Folly were a long, slow sharpening of a human weapon. The Ghostlands, a vast and uncharted wilderness of shifting sands, labyrinthine canyons, and skeletal forests straddling the border, became Alara's new home, her training ground, and her sanctuary. It was a land that did not suffer the weak, and it stripped away the last vestiges of the girl she had been, leaving in her place a woman as hard and unforgiving as the landscape itself. Her grief, aura and open wound, did not heal, petrified, becoming the unyielding core of her existence, a cold, dark stone of hatred in her chest. Her tutors were the last remnants of her father's world, Grizz and Coda. They were two sides of the same coin of survival, and they poured all their knowledge, all their experience, into the vessel of Alara's vengeance. They were not raising a daughter, they were forging an instrument of retribution. Grizz, his arm now stiff from the old wound, took it upon himself to school her in the art of the gun. The lessons began not with her father's heavy Colt Peacemaker, but with a lighter, more manageable Star revolver. He made her practice the draw for hours on end, until the motion was as unconscious as breathing. It wasn't about speed, he taught her, but about economy. Speed gets you killed, he'd rumble, his voice like grinding rocks. It makes you sloppy. Every motion has to have a purpose. From the moment your hand touches the grip to the moment the hammer falls, it's one thought, one single, clean line. Anything else is just dancing for your own funeral. He taught her to shoot not just with her eyes, but with her entire body, to field aim rather than just see it. They spent months shooting at stationary targets, then moving once in cans tossed in the air, swinging gourds, until she could hit them without conscious thought. He taught her the anatomy of a gunfight, how to use cover, how to read an opponent's intentions in the flicker of his eyes, how to control her own breathing and fear in a storm of lead. He also taught her the gunsmith's craft, how to clean, repair, and even modify her weapons, to know them as intimately as she knew her own hands. While Grizz forged her into a gunslinger, Coda reshaped her into a ghost. The silent Apache tracker taught her the lessons the earth itself had taught him. He taught her to walk on rock without leaving a scuff, to move through thick brush without snapping a twig. He showed her how to read the land like a book, to find water where there was none, to identify edible plants and avoid poisonous ones. He taught her the art of the ambush, the principles of misdirection, and the cruel, practical use of traps and snares. Coda's most important lessons, however, were in the art of becoming invisible. He would take her to a rocky outcrop and tell her to hide. Then he would hunt her. For hours he would track her, and in the beginning, he always found her. But slowly, she learned. She learned to use the shadows, to mimic the patterns of the rocks, to control her scent, to silence her very presence until she could melt into the landscape. She learned to be patient, to lie motionless for hours, observing, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She was no longer just a human moving through the wilderness, she was becoming a part of it, a predatory extension of the harsh, silent land. Her education was not just physical, it was a deep, psychological conditioning. The stories Grizz and Coda told around their meager campfires were not children's fables, but harsh morality plays of the West. They were tales of betrayal, of government cruelty, of the hypocrisy of the so-called civilized world that had hunted her father down. They spoke of the Bluecoats not as soldiers, but as an invading army, an iron tide that sought to crush the spirit of the free lands. They nurtured her hatred, watered it, tended to it like a precious, night-blooming flower. Her vengeance was not just a personal quest, they framed it as a righteous war against an unjust power. The final stage of her transformation came when she was 20. Grizz, his face grim, laid her father's Colt on a blanket. It was a beautiful, deadly thing, its metal worn smooth by Silas Vance's hand. "You're ready for this now," he said. The gun felt heavy in her hand, a direct, physical link to the man she had lost. When she strapped on the gun belt, it felt less like an accessory and more like a part of her body. That night, she had a dream. She dreamt of her father, not as the fallen man in the dust, but as he was in life, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled. He didn't speak, but he laid a hand on her shoulder, and the gesture was one not of warning, but of approval. She awoke with a sense of cold, clear purpose. The years of training were over. The time for hiding was at an end. Her first test came not against a soldier, but against 3 prospectors who stumbled upon their hidden camp. The men were rough, desperate, and greedy. They saw a young woman, an old man, and a lone Apache, and they saw an easy target. Their eyes lingered on Alara with a leering hunger that made her skin crawl. "Well now, look what we got here," their leader, a big man with a sweat-stained hat, said, his hand casually drifting toward his gun. "This ain't no place for folks like you. Best you pack up and leave us your supplies." And the girl. Grizz moved to stand, but Alara put a hand on his arm, her touch firm. "I'll handle this," she said, her voice calm and low. She rose to her feet slowly, her hands held open and away from her gun. "There's no need for trouble," she said. "We have nothing you'd want." The man laughed. "I think I see something I want." He took a step forward, and in that moment, the years of training took over. Alara didn't think. She reacted. The world seemed to slow down, just as Grizz had always described. She saw the man's intention in the tightening of his shoulders, the slight shift of his weight. Her hand moved in that single, clean line Grizz had drilled into her. The cold peacemaker, her father's gun, seemed to leap into her hand. It roared once. The prospector was thrown backward, a look of stunned surprise on his face, a neat, dark hole in his chest. The other two, momentarily frozen in shock, fumbled for their own weapons. Koda's bowstring twanged, and an arrow appeared in the throat of the second man. The third, his face a mask of terror, managed to fire a wild shot that kicked up dust near Alara's feet. Her second shot was as precise as the first. The man crumpled to the ground. Silence descended, broken only by the echo of the gunshots rolling through the canyons. Alara stood over the bodies, the smoking Colt still in her hand. She looked at the dead men, at the blood seeping into the thirsty ground, and she felt nothing. No fear, no remorse, only a cold, grim satisfaction. She had been tested, and she had not been found wanting. She was not just a survivor. She was a killer. Grizz walked over and placed a heavy hand on her shoulder. His face was a mixture of pride and a deep, profound sorrow. He had helped create this avenging angel, and he knew that her path from this day forward would be one of sorrow and blood. "It's starting, ain't it, Ollie girl?" he said softly. Alara looked up at him, her eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky. "It started 10 years ago," she replied. "This is just the first payment on the debt." She turned and began to methodically reload her father's gun. The girl who had wept for her father was gone, buried deep in the ghostlands. In her place stood the outlaw's daughter, a woman forged in sorrow, honed by hatred, and now, finally, ready to begin her war. With her first taste of blood still coppery on her tongue, Alara's focus narrowed to a single, burning point, her list. It was a list she had compiled over years, gleaned from Grizz's contacts in the underworld and Koda's silent reconnaissance. It was a list of the officers who had ridden with Captain Thorne into Vance's Folly, the men who had led the squads, who had given the orders, who had fired the shots that had shattered her world. The first name on that list, the easiest to find, was Sergeant Elias Miller. Miller was a man who had built a career on being a blunt instrument. He was known for his brutality, his heavy-handed enforcement of the law, and his unswerving loyalty to Captain Thorne, under whom he had served 4 years. After the successful Cimarron campaign, Miller had been rewarded with a promotion to lieutenant and a relatively comfortable posting at Fort Defiance, a dusty, sun-baked outpost on the edge of the Navajo territory. He had grown complacent, his days filled with supervising drills and his nights with cheap whiskey in the nearby settlement. He had long since forgotten the face of the young girl whose father he had helped kill. But Laura had not forgotten his. She remembered his thick, red mustache and the cruel laughter in his eyes as he had herded the captured members of her father's gang. Alara did not approach Fort Defiance like an army. She approached it like a plague, a creeping sickness that would infect the fort with fear before she ever fired a shot. For a full week, she and Koda observed the fort from a hidden mesa miles away. Using an old spyglass her father had once owned, she learned the fort's rhythms, the changing of the guards, the timing of the patrols. The well-worn path Miller took each night to the dusty collection of tents and shacks that passed for a town. She learned his habits, his vices, his arrogance. Her campaign began not with a bullet, but with a whisper. Koda, using his knowledge of the local tribes, began to spread stories among the Navajo scouts who sometimes worked for the army. He spoke of a vengeful spirit, a chindi of a great outlaw, that now haunted the canyons, seeking retribution against the bluecoats. He described a ghost rider, a woman with eyes like chips of ice, and the marksmanship of a demon. The first physical sign of her presence was the discovery of a dead sentry. He was found at his post at dawn, not a mark on him, except for the look of pure, undiluted terror frozen on his face. He had died of a heart attack, the post surgeon declared. But clutched in his hand was a single, raven-black feather, Koda's calling card. The superstitious whispers among the enlisted men began to grow louder. A few nights later, a 2-man patrol on the fort's perimeter simply vanished. A search party found their horses, saddles, and rifles still intact. Of the men, there was no trace, save for 2 more black feathers laid carefully on the empty saddles. In reality, Coda had disabled them with silent efficiency, and Alara had left them bound, gagged, and stripped of their uniforms miles away in the desert with enough water for a day. They would be found eventually, but their story of being hunted by a silent and seen force would only add fuel to the growing panic. Fear began to rot the discipline of the fort from the inside out. Men started seeing shadows in the twilight. They jumped at the sound of the wind whistling through the stockade. They refused to take the night patrols alone. Lieutenant Miller, a man who ruled by bluster and intimidation, was furious. He cursed his men for their cowardice, dismissing the stories as drunken fantasies. His arrogance made him blind. Alara chose her moment. It was a moonless, starless night, the sky a blanket of black velvet. Miller, after a long evening of drinking and losing at cards, was making his way back to his quarters in the fort, stumbling with a drunken swagger. He was angry, muttering curses about the spineless recruits he had to command. Alara was waiting. Not in the open, but in the shadows of the stables, a place she had slipped into hours before, moving with the silence Coda had taught her. As Miller passed the wide stable doors, a low whistle, mimicking the call of a nighthawk, cut through the air. Miller paused, his drunken brain slowly processing the sound. It was out of place. He peered into the darkness, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Who's there?" he slurred. From the deepest shadows within the stable a voice, low and feminine, but laced with the chilling rasp of cold iron, replied, "You don't remember me, Lieutenant, but I remember you." Miller squinted, trying to place the voice. And then she stepped forward, just enough for the faint light of a distant lantern to catch the planes of her face. He saw the raven hair, the flint-hard eyes, the cold peacemaker held loosely, but ready, at her side. Recognition, and with it, a sudden, sobering wave of terror, washed over him. He saw not the woman standing before him, but the ghost of a 16-year-old girl in a canyon of death. "Dance's brat," he breathed, the words catching in his throat. "My father's daughter," she corrected, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You were at the folly. You laughed." Miller's bluster returned, a thin shield for his fear. "You're wanted, girl. You're a long way from your hiding hole. I'll see you hang." His hand, slick with sweat, began to move toward his gun. "No," Alara said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You won't." She didn't give him the chance for a fair draw. This wasn't a duel of honor. It was an execution. Her father's Colt was in her hand, a blur of motion in the darkness. She didn't fire at his chest. She fired at his gun hand. The shot was a deafening roar in the confined space. Miller screamed, a high, thin sound, as the bullet shattered the bones in his wrist, sending his revolver spinning into the dirt. He clutched his ruined hand, his face a mask of agony and disbelief. "You bitch," he howled. Alara walked slowly toward him, her footsteps soft in the hay-strewn dirt. She raised the Colt, the long, dark barrel now aimed directly between his eyes. He stared into the black and blinking hole of the muzzle, and in it, he saw his own damnation. He saw the faces of the men he had killed, the laws he had broken in the name of the law, the ghost of Silas Vance come to claim his due. "This is for my father," she said, her voice as cold and final as a tombstone. The second shot echoed through the terrified fort. By the time the soldiers, roused by the gunshots, arrived at the stables, she was gone. They found Lieutenant Miller lying dead in the dirt, his face a frozen mask of terror, his shattered hand still clutched to his chest. And placed neatly on his uniform, over the bullet hole in his heart, was a single, perfect raven black feather. The legend of the outlaw's daughter was born that night, not as a whisper, but as a gunshot in the dark. The news of Miller's death, and the strange, ghostly circumstances surrounding it, spread through the territory like a contagion. Soldiers at remote outposts spoke her name in hushed tones. Settlers and outlaws alike told the story of the woman who was hunting the cavalry, a phantom of vengeance with a dead man's gun and a ghost's touch. In the territorial headquarters, Captain Marcus Thorne read the report from Fort Defiance, his jaw tight, his gray eyes like chips of granite. He crumpled the paper in his fist. This was no random outlaw attack. This was personal. This was a message. The war he thought he had won 10 years ago in a dusty canyon had just followed him home, and the ghost he had created now had a name. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that she was coming for him. The execution of Lieutenant Miller sent a shockwave through the military infrastructure of the territory. But it was Alar's next move that transformed her from a mysterious killer into a strategic threat. Her list was not just a collection of names, it was a roadmap to dismantling Captain Thorne's network of command. The next man on it was Captain Jameson, a logistics officer who had been responsible for coordinating the intelligence that led to the raid on Vance's Folly. Jameson was now stationed at Fort Lowell, a larger, more fortified post near Tucson, a hub of cavalry operations. A direct assault was impossible, and a simple assassination wouldn't suffice. Alar's goal was not just to kill the man, but to unravel the very system he represented. To do this, she needed resources and information, things she couldn't get alone. This forced her to step out of the Ghostlands and back into the murky world her father had once inhabited, a world of shifting allegiances and long memories. Her destination was the town of Perdition, a lawless settlement on the Mexican border that served as a sanctuary for outlaws, smugglers, and anyone else who preferred to live beyond the reach of a federal warrant. It was a place where her father's name still held weight. Riding into Perdition was like stepping into a half-forgotten dream. The faces were harder, the eyes more guarded, but the smell of cheap whiskey, sweat, and dust was the same. She, Grizz, and Coda made for the cantina run by an old acquaintance of her father's, a man named Ricardo. Ricardo was a man who traded in secrets, his cantina a neutral ground where information was the most valuable currency. When Alara entered, a hush fell over the room. Her reputation had preceded her. They saw the scarred colt on her hip, the cold resolve in her eyes, and the two formidable figures flanking her. They saw the legend of the outlaw's daughter in the flesh. Ricardo, a portly man with shrewd, calculating eyes, recognized Grizz immediately. He led them to a back room, away from prying ears. "Grizz, you old dog," Ricardo said, pouring 3 glasses of tequila. "I heard you had died. And this must be the girl. Alara, the last time I saw you, you were a child." His eyes lingered on her, a mixture of awe and pity. "The stories are true, then? You're waging a war against the Bluecoats." "I'm settling a debt," Alara corrected, her voice flat. "I need to know about Fort Lowell, patrol routes, supply schedules, the habits of a Captain Jameson." Ricardo swirled the tequila in his glass. "That is dangerous information, Chica. Thorne has ears everywhere. Helping you is risky. My father considered you a friend," Grizz growled. "And he paid you well for that friendship." Ricardo sighed, the calculation in his eyes giving way to a flicker of old loyalty. Silas was a good man, for a thief. He was fair. Unlike the cavalry, he downed his drink. "All right. For Silas, I will tell you what I know. But I will also give you some advice, for free. This path you are on, it ends in only one of 2 places, a grave or a gallows. There is no peace at the end of it." "Peace died with my father," Alara said, her voice so cold it seemed to lower the temperature in the room. "Just give me the information." Ricardo gave her what she needed, and more. He told her of a weak point in the fort's supply line, a weekly wagon train that traveled through a narrow canyon known as Devil's Jaw. It was a route they considered safe, as no one had ever dared to attack a military convoy. He also told her something else. Living in Perdition was another man who had ridden with her father, a demolitions expert named Finn, a weary Irishman with a wild look in his eyes and a love for dynamite. Finn had survived the massacre by being away on a scouting mission, but the loss of his friends, and Silas in particular, had broken something in him. He now spent his days drinking and brawling, a ghost haunted by his own survival. Alara found Finn in the darkest corner of the cantina, nursing a bottle. He was a wreck, his clothes ragged, his hands trembling. But when she mentioned her father's name, a spark of the old fire returned to his eyes. "Silas Vance's little girl," he slurred, looking her up and down. "Come to spit on your old man's grave like the rest of this cursed world." "No," Alara said, sitting opposite him. "I've come to finish his war. I'm going to hit the Fort Lowell supply train at Devil's Jaw. I need someone who knows how to make a big noise." Finn stared at her, his drunken haze slowly clearing. He saw in her face the same stubborn fire that had been in her father's. For the first time in 10 years, he saw purpose. "You're insane," he breathed. "It's suicide." "It's a start," she replied. "They'll hunt you to the ends of the earth," he warned. "They're already hunting me," she said. The only question is whether I die running or fighting. I need to know, Finn. Are you with me? A slow, wolfish grin spread across the Irishman's face. "Aye," he said, his voice a low growl. "For Silas. Let's give those blue-bellied bastards a little taste of hell." The plan they hatched was daring and precise. Coda scouted the canyon, finding the perfect spot for an ambush, a place where a rock slide could be triggered to block the convoy's path. Finn, with a renewed sense of purpose, gathered his precious dynamite. Grizz, a master tactician, helped Alara plan the attack down to the last detail. The ambush was a masterpiece of guerrilla warfare. As the supply convoy, a train of 6 wagons guarded by a platoon of 20 soldiers, entered the narrowest part of Devil's Jaw, Finn's dynamite charge went off with a deafening roar. The canyon walls trembled, and tons of rock and earth cascaded down, blocking the exit and throwing the convoy into chaos. Before the dust had even settled, Alara and her small band opened fire from the cliffs above. It was a slaughter. The soldiers, trapped and exposed in the canyon, had no effective cover. Alara was a demon, her father's colt barking, each shot finding its mark. Grizz, with a heavy buffalo rifle, picked off troopers from long range. Coda rained arrows down on the panicked wagon drivers. The battle was short and brutal. The surviving soldiers, their morale shattered, threw down their weapons and surrendered. Alara and her group descended from the cliffs. They did not harm the prisoners. They were soldiers, not officers on her list. She had their weapons collected and the horses set loose. "Walk back to Fort Lowell," she told the terrified sergeant in charge. "Tell Captain Jameson that the daughter of Silas Vance sends her regards. Tell him his payroll is being donated to the poor of perdition. And tell him I'm coming for him next." They looted the lead wagon, taking the army payroll chest, then set fire to the rest of the supplies ammunition, food, uniforms, leaving a pillar of black smoke that could be seen for 50 miles. The message was clear. This was not just a robbery. It was an act of war, a direct blow to the U.S. Army's power and prestige. The raid on Devil's Jaw cemented her legend. She was no longer just a ghost who killed in the night. She was a leader, a brilliant strategist who could challenge the cavalry on her own terms. The money from the payroll, which she had Grizz and Ricardo distribute among the destitute families in the border towns, also earned her a new title, a Robin Hood figure, a champion of the oppressed. But as they rode away from the burning wagons, leaving the humiliated soldiers to their long walk home, Alara felt the familiar coldness settle in her heart. The victory was thrilling, the tactical success undeniable, but the fire of her hatred demanded a more personal satisfaction. She had bloodied the army's nose, but the names on her list remained. And the next one, Captain Jameson, now knew she was coming. The hunt was about to get personal. The aftermath of the Devil's Jaw ambush sent Captain Marcus Thorne into a cold, calculated fury. This was no longer a series of isolated acts of revenge, it was a campaign. The outlaw's daughter, this ghost from his past, was not just a killer, she was a tactician. She had humiliated his army, destroyed his supplies, stolen his payroll, and, worst of all, she was winning the war of whispers and legends among the populace. Thorne was a man who despised chaos, and Alara Vance was a whirlwind of it. He redeployed his forces, pulling patrols from the frontiers and concentrating them on a single objective, hunting down and eradicating Alara and her small band of insurgents. The territory became a chessboard, and the deadly game between the disciplined captain and the phantom outlaw had begun. Alara knew that a direct assault on a man like Captain Jameson inside the now high-alert Fort Lowell was impossible. She had to draw him out. Using the network of sympathizers her recent generosity had cultivated, she began to feed false information to the army's informants. She had whispers of her presence sent north, near the Apache reservations, while simultaneously planning a strike far to the south. Her target was a critical telegraph relay station at Apache Pass, the nerve center of Thorne's communication network. Destroying it would blind him, sowing confusion and disrupting his ability to coordinate his troops. It was also a target that Captain Jameson, as a logistics and communications officer, would be forced to personally inspect and secure. The attack on the relay station was another exercise in brutal efficiency. Finn, the Irishman with a love for pyrotechnics, was in his element. Under the cover of a thunderstorm that masked their approach, he and Alara slipped past the station's sentries. They didn't engage in a prolonged firefight. Finn planted his charges at the base of the main telegraph pole and against the wall of the communications hut. The resulting explosion was a blinding flash of light and a deafening roar that was swallowed by the storm's thunder. The station was obliterated. Just as Alara had predicted, the destruction of the relay station forced Jameson's hand. He was a man who prized order and efficiency, and the severing of his communication lines was an intolerable offense. Overruling the concerns of his subordinates, he personally led a large company of 40 troopers out from Fort Lowell to secure the pass and hunt down the perpetrators. He was a capable officer, but he was an administrator, not a seasoned field commander. He was moving from his fortress onto Alara's home turf. He was moving onto her side of the chessboard. Alara, Grizz, Coda, and Finn did not flee. They retreated into the Dragon Mountains, a formidable natural fortress of rock spires and hidden canyons that had been a stronghold of the Apaches for generations. Kodo was the master here. He led them through trails that didn't exist on any army map. And they waited. They let Jameson's company ride into the mountains, deeper and deeper into the maze. The campaign that followed was not one of open battles, but of 1,000 small cuts. It was a war of nerves and attrition. Kodo would use his knowledge of the terrain to lead the cavalry patrols into dead-end box canyons. Grizz, with his long-range buffalo rifle, would become a phantom sniper, picking off a single soldier from an impossible distance before melting back into the rocks, leaving the terrified platoon to fire at shadows. Finn would rig rock slides and deadfalls along the main trails, harassing their supply lines and making every step treacherous. Alara was the ghost at the center of it all. She led lightning-fast raids on their campsites at night, not to kill, but to create chaos, setting horses loose, destroying water barrels, firing a few shots to keep the soldiers awake, exhausted, and on edge. She became a drain on their morale. The soldiers, far from the safety of their fort, began to feel like they were not the hunters, but the hunted. They were in a foreign, hostile land, fighting an enemy they could not see, an enemy who seemed to be everywhere at once. Captain Jameson grew increasingly frustrated. His disciplined, orderly world was falling apart. His men were exhausted and demoralized. His supply lines were in shambles. He was constantly reporting his failures back to a silently furious Captain Thorne via couriers, as the telegraph was still down. He made a fatal mistake. Driven by desperation and arrogance, he split his forces, sending out smaller hunter-killer patrols to cover more ground, believing he could trap the ghost by closing the net. But all he had done was make his men more vulnerable. This was the moment Alara had been waiting for. She and her band targeted one of these isolated patrols, a group of 10 men led by a young and experienced lieutenant. The ambush was classic Apache tactics, taught to her by Koda. They didn't attack from one direction, but from all sides at once, appearing from the rocks like spirits of the earth. The firefight was over in minutes. They captured the entire patrol without a single casualty on their side. Alara now had her bait. She sent one of the captured troopers back to Jameson's main camp. He carried a message, not written, but memorized. "Tell your captain he has lost his queen," the soldier was instructed to say. "If he wants his men back, he is to come alone to the Canyon of the Vultures at dawn. If he brings his army, his men will die." Jameson was caught in an impossible trap. To refuse would be to condemn his men and prove his cowardice. To accept was to walk into his own grave. His pride and his duty forced his hand. Convinced he could outsmart a mere outlaw girl, he accepted the terms. But he had no intention of going alone. He planned a trap of his own, ordering his main force to secretly surround the canyon during the night. But he was playing chess against a grandmaster of this terrain. Koda, whose senses were as sharp as any wolf's, detected the movement of the troopers in the night. He heard the displaced stones, smelled the scent of their horses on the wind. He warned Alara. The trap had been seen. When Captain Jameson rode into the Canyon of the Vultures at dawn, he found his 9 captured soldiers alive, but bound and gagged. He felt a surge of triumph, thinking he had cornered his prey. He gave the signal, and his troopers began to close in on the canyon from the ridges above. But Alara was not in the canyon. She, Grizz, and Finn were positioned on an even higher ridge, looking down on Jameson's would-be ambushers. As the cavalrymen moved into their positions, Finn's dynamite, strategically placed during the night, exploded. triggering a massive rock slide that cut off the troopers' retreat and sent half their force scrambling for cover. Then, from above them, Grizz's heavy rifle began to bark. It was Diablo's spine all over again, but this time, the targets were the trappers, not the trapped. Alara, with her father's Colt, added to the deadly fire. Down in the canyon, Jameson, his face a mask of horror and disbelief, realized he had not set a trap. He had walked into a far more sophisticated one. His plan was in ruins, his men being picked off from above. And then, a single shot, fired by Alara from over 300 yards away, a shot of impossible skill and luck, ricocheted off a rock near his head. It was a warning. A voice, amplified by the canyon's acoustics, echoed down from the cliffs. It was Alara. Jameson, this is between you and me. Call them off, or they all die. Jameson, his nerve broken, his carefully laid plans a smoking ruin, screamed at his men to cease fire, to pull back. As they scrambled away in disarray, Alara made her way down into the canyon, a lone figure emerging from the morning mist. She stood before the stunned, defeated captain. "You helped kill my father," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying the weight of a death sentence. "He was an outlaw," Jameson stammered, his hand inching toward his pistol. "He broke the law. And you are a man who has lost a war," Alara replied. She didn't wait for him to draw. She didn't need to. Her Colt was in her hand, and it roared once. She left Captain Jameson dead in the dust, next to his freed but terrified men. She had not only killed another man on her list, but she had outgeneraled, outfought, and psychologically shattered a superior cavalry force. As she and her small band melted back into the mountains, they knew Captain Thorne's response would be swift and terrible. The Devil's chessboard had been cleared of one of his major pieces, and the king himself would now be coming for them with the full, unrestrained fury of the U.S. Army. The news of Captain Jameson's death and the utter rout of his company in the Dragoon Mountains was not a story that could be contained. It was a humiliation that echoed all the way to the territorial capital. Captain Marcus Thorne, the man of iron and order, was now seen as the man who couldn't control his own backyard. The legend of the Outlaw's daughter grew to mythic proportions. She was an avenging angel, an Apache spirit, a military genius. To the downtrodden and the lawless, she was a symbol of defiance. To the U.S. Army, she was a cancer. For Thorne, it was no longer a matter of law enforcement. It was a personal vendetta, a stain upon his immaculate record and his unbending pride. He became obsessed. The maps in his office were covered in pins and lines, tracking her supposed movements. He interrogated the survivors of Jameson's company relentlessly, trying to build a psychological profile of his adversary. He saw in her tactics the ghost of her father's cunning, but combined with a ruthlessness and a strategic patience that was all her own. He realized he was not fighting a common bandit. He was fighting a guerrilla commander. He also realized that his conventional tactics were failing. He couldn't beat her in the wilderness. She and her Apache tracker owned that ground. He needed to change the battlefield. He needed to find a weakness, a thread he could pull to unravel her. And he believed he had found one, her burgeoning reputation as a champion of the people. She had allies, sympathizers, a network that fed her information and gave her shelter. Thorne decided that if he couldn't destroy her, he would poison the ground she walked on. He implemented a new, brutal policy. Any settlement, any ranch, any individual suspected of aiding Alara Vance would be subject to the harshest military justice. Rations were confiscated. Homes were searched without warrant. Men were arrested on the flimsiest of suspicions and held in the fort's stockade. He began a campaign of fear, aiming to isolate Alara by turning the people who supported her against her. He would make the cost of helping the outlaw's daughter to high to bear. The policy had an immediate and devastating effect. The whispers that had once carried vital intelligence to Alara were now replaced by fearful silence. Doors that had once been open to Grizz and Kodo were now closed. The network of support began to dry up. Ricardo, the cantina owner in Perdition, sent a coded message. "The eagle is now hunting the sparrows. The ground has become salty." Alara felt the shift immediately. Her war had, up to this point, been against soldiers, against the men on her list. Now, she saw the faces of innocent people suffering because of her actions. She saw families go hungry because their grain had been seized. She heard of men being beaten for information they didn't have. This was a kind of warfare she was not prepared for, a battle for hearts and minds, and it struck at the one thing she had left that wasn't hardened by hate, the lingering echo of her father's code. Silas Vance had robbed from the rich and the powerful, but he had never brought harm to the common folk. The moral weight of her campaign began to press down on her. One evening, as they made camp in the high mountains, Grizz confronted her. His face, usually a mask of grizzled stoicism, was etched with worry. "This ain't right, Allie girl," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Thorn ain't fighting you anymore. He's fighting farmers and shopkeepers. He's using them to get to you. This ain't your father's way." "My father is dead," she snapped, her voice sharp. "Thorn and his men killed him. This is the only way." "Is it?" Grizz pressed, his gaze unwavering. "Look at what it's costing. Not us. Them. The people your pa always looked out for. What's the point of winning this war if you burn down the whole world to do it?" His words struck a nerve, echoing the doubts that had begun to fester in her own mind. She remembered Ricardo's warning, "There is no peace at the end of this path." She was so focused on the ghosts of the past that she had been blind to the living victims of the present. The cold certainty of her mission was, for the first time, clouded by a painful, confusing fog of guilt. Thorn, meanwhile, was not just waiting for his policy of oppression to work. He was actively setting a trap, and he knew exactly what bait to use. His intelligence, squeezed from a terrified informant, had identified Finn, the Irishman, as a key part of Alara's group. He also learned that Finn had a weakness, a younger sister, Bev, who worked as a laundress in the booming mining town of Tombstone, a place far from the current conflict. Finn sent her money whenever he could, a secret connection to a life he thought he had left behind. Thorn saw his opening. He dispatched a unit of his best men, operating in plain clothes, to Tombstone. They didn't arrest Mav. They simply put her under surveillance. Then, Thorn let a rumor slip through a trusted double agent, a rumor intended for Alara's ears. He let it be known that he was planning to transport a massive army payroll, a tempting target, from Fort Huachuca to Tombstone. He made sure the details of the route and the light guard were part of the rumor. The bait was perfect. It was a target Alara couldn't resist, a chance to cripple Thorn's finances and resupply her own dwindling resources. And, crucially, it would draw her close to Tombstone. When the news of the payroll reached Alara, she was immediately suspicious. It felt too easy. But Finn, hearing that the route would pass near Tombstone, was eager. He saw it as a chance to hit the army and maybe get a message to his sister. "It's a trap, Finn," Alara warned, her instincts screaming at her. "Or it's a chance, girl," the Irishman argued, his eyes gleaming with the prospect of action. "Thorn's getting arrogant. He thinks he's scared us into hiding. This is our chance to show him we're not done yet." Against her better judgment, and swayed by the need to strike a blow against Thorn's escalating cruelty, she agreed. But she would plan it her way, with extreme caution. Coda was sent ahead to scout, to watch Tombstone, to be her eyes and ears. Coda returned 2 days later, his face grim. The payroll story was a fabrication. There was no convoy. But there was something else. He had seen Finn's sister, Mev. And he had seen the plainclothes soldiers watching her, their presence a subtle but unmistakable threat. The nature of Thorn's trap was suddenly, sickeningly clear. It wasn't the payroll. It was Finn. Thorn knew she would not abandon one of her own. He was using Finn's love for his sister to lure them all into a cage. When Alara told Finn, the Irishman's face went white. The wild, reckless fire in his eyes was replaced by a cold, stark terror. "Mev," he whispered. "That devil. He's using my sister." Alara now faced an impossible choice. To ignore the trap would be to abandon Finn to his guilt and Mev to Thorn's clutches. To walk into it would be to risk everything, to face Thorn on his chosen ground, a bustling town where her skills in the wilderness meant nothing. Grizz looked at her, his old eyes full of a sad understanding. "He's found it, Allie. He's found the thread to pull. What we do now, it changes everything." Alara looked at Finn's anguished face, and she saw not just an ally, but a reflection of her own pain. Her war had been born from the loss of family. How could she now demand that he sacrifice his? The decision was made in that instant. Her hatred for Thorn was a cold, constant star, but her loyalty to the people who stood by her was the ground beneath her feet. "We're going to Tombstone," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "We're not going for a payroll. We're getting your sister out." She looked at her small band of warriors, the old gunslinger, the Apache tracker, the Irish bomber. And then, she added, her eyes turning to ice, "We are going to burn Captain Thorn's world to the ground." She was walking into the lion's den, not as a guerrilla fighter, but as a rescuer. The battlefield had changed, and the stakes were no longer just about vengeance. They were about survival, loyalty, and the very soul of her rebellion. Tombstone was a town perched on the razor's edge between civilization and savagery. It was a place of frantic energy, its streets teeming with miners, gamblers, merchants, and lawmen, all drawn by the siren song of the silver boom. For Laura, entering the bustling town was like stepping onto another planet. The open skies and silent canyons of her world were replaced by a claustrophobic maze of wooden buildings, the quiet language of the wind drowned out by a cacophony of piano music, drunken shouts, and the clatter of wagon wheels. Here, her skills as a ghost of the wilderness were nullified. She was a hawk forced to walk in a chicken coop, surrounded by threats she couldn't easily see or understand. They entered the town not as a war party, but as drifters. Laura traded her practical buckskins for a simple, dusty riding skirt and blouse, her hair tied back, her father's coat hidden beneath a woolen shawl. Grizz posed as a prospecting old-timer, Finn as a down-on-his-luck miner, and Coda, his Apache features making him an object of suspicion, remained on the outskirts, a silent, watchful shadow. Their first priority was to understand the layout of Thorn's trap. Laura and Finn located the laundry where Mev worked. From the saloon across the street, they watched. Mev was a young woman with the same fiery red hair as her brother, her face etched with a constant worry. And just as Coda had reported, Thorn's men were everywhere. They weren't in uniform. They were disguised as cowboys, miners, and gamblers, but their military posture and the way their eyes constantly scanned the street betrayed them. They were a net, and Mev was the bait at its center. "There's too many of them," Finn whispered, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. "We can't just walk in and take her." "We won't," Laura said, her eyes narrowed in concentration. "We don't play his game. We make him play ours." The plan she devised was one of misdirection and chaos, designed to turn the town's crowded, unpredictable environment from a weakness into a weapon. The key was to separate Mev from her watchers and create a diversion so loud and so chaotic that it would draw the attention of every lawman and soldier in Tombstone. The first step was communication. That night, Coda, moving with a silence that defied belief, slipped through the back alleys of Tombstone. He left a small, intricately carved wooden bird, a symbol Finn and his sister had used as children, on the windowsill of Mev's small room behind the laundry. Inside a hollow compartment was a simple message: "Midnight. St. Paul's Church. Be ready." The second step was the diversion. That was Grizz's and Finn's job. Finn, using his expertise, crafted several small but powerful explosive charges. Grizz, using his knowledge of the town's layout, identified the perfect target: the Grand Hotel's new, ostentatious clock tower, the pride of Tombstone and a symbol of its burgeoning wealth. It was a target that would cause immense noise and confusion without causing widespread harm to innocent people. As night fell, a palpable tension settled over the town. Thorn, who had arrived and set up a command post in the U.S. Marshal's office, was confident. He knew his prey was in town. He could feel it. He had the town locked down, his men in position. He was waiting for the rabbit to bolt from its hole. Just before midnight, the play began. Grizz, from a rooftop vantage point, used a small, silenced rifle to shoot out the main lamps on Allen Street, plunging the center of town into a confusing darkness. Seconds later, Finn's charges went off. The explosion at the base of the clock tower was spectacular. It didn't destroy the tower, but it sent the huge clock face crashing down into the street with a monumental clang of shattered glass and twisted metal. It was a thunderclap that shook the entire town. Pandemonium erupted. People poured out of the saloons, shouting and confused. The local lawmen, led by the town marshal, ran toward the source of the explosion. Thorn's soldiers, their discipline momentarily broken by the shock and the darkness, were drawn into the chaos, their attention pulled toward the Grand Hotel. The net had been ripped open. In that carefully orchestrated moment of confusion, Alara moved. Dressed in dark clothing, she was just another shadow in a town full of them. She met Mev at the back of the small, quiet church. The young woman was terrified but resolute, her trust in the symbol from her brother absolute. "Alara," she whispered, her eyes wide. "Finn sent me," Alara said, her voice low and urgent. "There's no time. We have to go now." They slipped through the back alleys, moving away from the chaos. But Thorn was no fool. He had kept a reserve, and as soon as he realized the explosion was a diversion, he knew where his real target would be. He and a half-dozen of his best men began to sweep the back streets, cutting off his escape routes. They were cornered in a narrow alley between the assayer's office and a smithy. At one end, Thorn and his men appeared, lanterns held high, their pistols drawn. At the other, 2 more soldiers blocked the path. "It's over, Vance," Thorn's voice boomed, echoing in the confined space. "There's nowhere left to run." Finn, who had circled around after setting his charges, appeared on the roof of the smithy. "Looking for me, Captain," he yelled, holding up his last stick of dynamite, a lit fuse sputtering in his hand. "This one's big enough to take this whole bloody alley with us." Thorn's men hesitated, their eyes nervously flicking from Alara to the mad Irishman on the roof. The standoff was a powder keg, the air thick with the promise of imminent, bloody violence. Alara knew they couldn't shoot their way out. She shoved Mev behind her. "Get her out of here, Finn," she yelled. "Not without you," he shouted back. "That's an order," she commanded, her voice imbued with a sudden, absolute authority that even her father would have recognized. In that split second of hesitation, as Thorn was deciding whether to call Finn's bluff, Alara did the unexpected. She drew her Colt. But she didn't fire at Thorn. She fired at the large water barrel standing next to him, a relic of the town's primitive firefighting system. The bullets tore through the wood, and a torrent of water erupted, dousing the soldiers' lanterns, plunging the alley into near-total darkness, and soaking Thorn and his men. "Now!" she screamed. Finn didn't hesitate. He dropped a smoke bomb he had prepared into the alley, filling it with a thick, acrid cloud. He then helped his sister scramble up onto the low roof of the assayer's office. Alara, using the chaos, the smoke, and the darkness, fired 2 more shots in Thorn's direction, not to kill but to keep their heads down, before vaulting over a stack of crates and disappearing into the joining alley. They escaped, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. They had rescued Mev, but Alara had been forced to separate from Grizz and Coda in the chaos. And worse, during the frantic escape, a stray bullet from one of Thorn's men had grazed her side, a burning, searing line of pain she had ignored in the heat of the moment but was now making itself known with a vengeance. They rendezvoused at the prearranged spot on the edge of town where Coda was waiting with the horses. Finn embraced his sister, his relief palpable. But their celebration was cut short when Alara stumbled, her hand pressed against her bleeding side. "Ali!" Grizz exclaimed, rushing to her side. He had made his own way out of the chaos and was waiting for them. The wound was deep, bleeding freely. They were fugitives, miles from any safe haven, with a wounded leader and a civilian to protect. They had walked into the lion's den and pulled the bait from its teeth, but the lion was now enraged, wounded in its pride, and its full, terrible roar was about to be unleashed upon them. The shadow play in Tombstone was over, but the bloodiest act was yet to come. The ride from Tombstone was a desperate, agonizing flight. Every jarring step of Alara's horse sent a fresh wave of fire through her side. The adrenaline that had sustained her during the escape had faded, leaving behind a cold, clammy sweat and a throbbing pain that threatened to pull her into unconsciousness. The blackness crept at the edges of her vision, and it was only Grizz's steadying hand on her back and the burning image of Captain Thorn's hate-filled face that kept her in the saddle. Coda, his senses on high alert, led them on a punishing, circuitous route through the rock-strewn hills, erasing their trail as they went. They couldn't stop, not yet. Thorn would have every patrol in a 100-mile radius scouring the territory for them. They were no longer the hunters. For the first time, they were the prey, and the predator was relentless. They finally found refuge in a place of ghosts, an abandoned Apache stronghold deep in the Karikahua Mountains, a place Coda knew from his youth. It was a natural fortress, accessible only by a single, hidden trail, a place where they could finally tend to Alara's wound. The bullet had torn a ragged furrow along her ribs. It was not a fatal wound, but it was deep, and the risk of fever was high. As Grizz, with his surprisingly gentle hands, cleaned and stitched the wound with a horsehair needle, Alara drifted in a haze of pain and fever. In her delirium, the ghosts of her past came to her. She saw her father, his face etched with a sorrow she had never seen in life. He didn't speak, but his eyes asked a single, silent question: was it worth it? She saw the faces of Lieutenant Miller and Captain Jameson, their dead eyes accusing her. And she saw the innocent people, the farmers and their families, their faces gaunt with hunger, all suffering because of the war she had started. When the fever broke 2 days later, it left her weak, but her mind was terrifyingly clear. Lying on a bedroll in the cold, silent cave, listening to the wind howl outside, she was forced to confront the true cost of her quest. Grizz's words came back to her: what's the point of winning this war if you burn down the whole world to do it? She looked at her small, battered family of outcasts. Grizz, old and weary, his loyalty to her costing him his last years of peace. Coda, a man without a people, forced back into a war he had long ago tried to leave. Finn, and his sister Maeve, who now huddled by the fire, her life uprooted, a fugitive because of her brother's connection to Alara. Maeve was the living embodiment of the collateral damage of her war. The young woman was resilient, but terrified. She had been a simple laundress. Now she was a wanted fugitive, her future a terrifying blank. "My brother, he worshipped your father," Maeve said to Alara one evening, her voice barely a whisper. "He said Silas Vance was a king. But looking at Finn now, all I see is a man who's been running his whole life. This hate, it eats you from the inside out, doesn't it?" Her simple, honest words were more piercing than any bullet. Alara had always seen her hatred as a source of strength, a righteous fire that fueled her. But now, for the first time, she saw it as Maeve did a poison that had not only consumed her, but was now seeping out and sickening everyone she cared about. She had set out to avenge her father's death, but in the process, she was destroying any chance for the living to have a life. The final name on her list, besides Thorne himself, was a Major Covington, Thorne's second in command, the man who had physically led the charge into the canyon at Vance's Folly. He was the field commander, the butcher who had carried out the orders. Intelligence from Ricardo, passed through a series of cutouts, placed Covington at a temporary command post set up at an old, abandoned mission called St. Xavier, from where he was coordinating the massive manhunt for Alara. Her first instinct, the instinct honed by 10 years of hate, was to plan an attack, to finish the list. But as she looked at Maeve's frightened face, at Finn's guilt-ridden expression, a profound weariness settled over her. The cycle of violence felt endless, and for the first time, she wanted it to stop. She made a decision. It was a choice that would have been unthinkable to her just weeks before. She gathered them around the fire. "We're done running," she announced, her voice quiet but firm. "But we're not attacking the mission." "What are you saying, Helly?" Grizz asked, his brow furrowed. "I'm going to end this," she said. "Not with more killing. Thorne wants me. He's using all of you, all the people in this territory, to get to me. So I'm going to give him what he wants." "You're turning yourself in," Finn exclaimed, aghast. "They'll hang you." "I'm not turning myself in," she clarified, a new, dangerous light in her eyes. "I'm setting the terms of the final battle. I'm going to call him out. Just him. A final meeting. To end this where it all began." She looked at Finn. "You and Maeve, you're going to take what money we have left and head for California. Start a new life. This isn't your fight anymore." Finn started to protest, but Maeve placed a hand on his arm. "She's right, Finn," she said softly. "This has to end. For all of us." Alara then turned to Grizz and Coda. "I need you to for one last ride. I need you to get a message to Major Covington at the mission. And I need you to make sure he delivers it to Thorne." The message was simple. Alara Vance would cease all hostilities. She would surrender her army. In exchange, Captain Thorne was to meet her, alone, in 3 days' time, at the ruins of Vance's Folly. If he came with his army, she would disappear back into the Ghostlands and her war of shadows would continue until every last man on her list was dead. If he came alone, he would have the chance to face the ghost that had haunted him, and end it, one way or another. It was a duel, not just of guns, but of legacies. It was an audacious, almost insane gamble. She was betting everything on Thorn's pride, on his obsessive need to be the one to personally destroy her. She was changing the battlefield one last time, moving it from the physical world to the psychological. As Grizz and Coda prepared to leave, Grizz pulled her aside. "Are you sure about this, girl?" he asked, his old eyes searching hers. "This ain't a fight you can guarantee you'll walk away from." "I know," she said, her hand unconsciously going to her father's colt. "I stopped being sure of anything a long time ago, Grizz. But I know this: I'm tired of watching other people pay the price for my vengeance. It's time I paid it myself." She watched them ride away, two loyal shadows disappearing into the twilight. She was alone, save for the ghosts of her past. She had set the stage for the final act. Whether it ended in her death or her freedom, she knew one thing for certain: the war of the Outlaw's daughter was about to come to a bloody, definitive end in the very same dust where it had begun. The ruins of Vance's Folly were a graveyard of memories. The canyon that had once echoed with laughter and life was now silent, save for the mournful sigh of the wind whistling through the skeletal remains of the burned-out wagons and shacks. The sun beat down with a harsh and forgiving intensity, bleaching the old bloodstains in the dust to faint, brownish smudges. This was hallowed ground, a place of profound sorrow, and now Alara had chosen it as the stage for her final confrontation. She arrived a full day early, a solitary figure in the vast, empty landscape. She walked the grounds of her former home, her boots stirring up ghosts with every step. She stood on the spot where her father had fallen, the memory as sharp and as painful as it had been 10 years ago. But the hot, consuming rage that had fueled her for a decade was gone. In its place was a cold, quiet calm, the stillness of a soul that has made its peace with whatever comes next. She was not here for revenge anymore. She was here for release. Coda had remained behind, hidden high on the canyon rim, a silent guardian angel with a longbow. He was not there to intervene, but to bear witness, to ensure that Thorn honored the terms of the duel. Grizz had done his part, delivering the message to Major Covington, his presence and reputation ensuring the message was taken seriously and passed directly to Captain Thorn. Now, all they could do was wait. On the third day, at the appointed hour of high noon, a lone rider appeared at the mouth of the canyon. It was Captain Marcus Thorn. He had come alone, just as she had demanded. His pride, his obsession, had not allowed him to do otherwise. To bring his army would have been an admission that he, a decorated officer of the U.S. Cavalry, was afraid of a single woman. He rode slowly into the canyon, his bay horse picking its way through the debris. He was immaculate in his uniform, his back ramrod straight, his face a mask of cold, controlled authority. He reined in his horse 50 yards from where Lara stood waiting in the center of the clearing. The silence was absolute, broken only by the snort of Thorn's horse and the faint whisper of the wind. "So," Thorn said, his voice crisp and clear, devoid of any emotion. "The ghost finally shows herself." "I was never a ghost, Thorn," Alara replied, her voice steady. "I was a reckoning. You just refused to see me." "I see an outlaw," he retorted, dismounting with a fluid, practiced motion. "A murderer and a terrorist who has attacked the authority of the United States government. Your father was a disease in this territory. I merely excised it. My father built a home here," Alara said, her gaze unwavering. "He gave shelter to men the world had thrown away. You called it a disease. We called it a life. You didn't just kill an outlaw that day, Captain. You murdered a father in front of his child. There is no law that justifies that. The law is what I make it in these territories," Thorn stated, his arrogance absolute. "I am the instrument of order. You are an agent of chaos. It is my duty to put you down." "Your duty?" Alara's voice was laced with a bitter irony. "Was it your duty to punish innocent families for my actions? To use a young woman as bait to trap her brother? You speak of law, but you practice tyranny. You're no better than the men you hunt. You're just a killer with a flag." A flicker of anger, the first crack in his iron facade, showed in Thorn's eyes. "I will not be lectured on morality by the whelp of a common thief." He unbuttoned his holster flap, his hand resting near the butt of his regulation Colt revolver. "This ends today. Your legend dies here, in the same dust as your father." "Legends never die, Captain," Alara said softly. "People do." She slowly pushed back her shawl, revealing the worn, scarred handle of her father's peacemaker. This is not for my legend. This is for Alara Vance. For the life you stole from me. The final words hung in the air, a declaration that transcended law and vengeance. This was now a purely personal battle, stripped of all pretense. It was a clash of two worlds, two philosophies, two souls locked in a decade-long dance of death. The sun reached its zenith, blazing down directly overhead, erasing all shadows. The world seemed to hold its breath. Thorn, confident in his military training, his years of drills and qualifications, drew first. His movement was precise, efficient, by the book. It was the draw of a soldier. Alara's draw was something else entirely. It was not a trained reflex, it was an instinct, a part of her being, honed by 1,000 lonely dawns in the ghostlands. It was one single, fluid thought, a line drawn from her heart to her hand to the man who had broken her life. It was the draw of a survivor. Her father's cold cleared the leather a fraction of a second before Thorn's. It roared once, the sound a deafening echo that was both an end and a beginning. Thorn staggered back, a look of utter disbelief on his face. He had been beaten. His perfect, orderly world had been undone by a single, chaotic bullet. He looked down at the dark hole that had appeared over his heart. Then his cold, gray eyes met Alara's one last time. In them, she saw not hatred, but the shocking, hollow emptiness of a man whose entire identity had been obliterated in a single instant. He crumpled to the ground, his body landing in the same dust that had cradled her father. Alara stood, the smoking pistol in her hand, the smell of burnt gunpowder acrid in the air. She looked at the body of her great enemy, the man who had been the focal point of her entire existence for a decade. The fire of her hatred, which had burned so brightly for so long, finally flickered and died, leaving behind only the cold, gray ash of profound and utter exhaustion. She didn't feel triumph. She didn't feel joy. She felt empty. The great weight that had driven her was gone, and she felt untethered, a ghost in her own life. She slowly holstered her pistol and walked over to her father's unmarked grave. She knelt and placed a hand on the sun-warmed earth. "It's over, Father," she whispered to the silent dust. "It's finally over." High on the canyon rim, Coda watched as she finally, after 10 long years, allowed herself to weep. They were not tears of anger or of victory, but tears of deep, heartbreaking grief for the girl who had died in this canyon, for the woman she had become, and for the long and certain road that now lay ahead. The outlaw's daughter had won her war, but the price had been her entire world. The death of Captain Marcus Thorne was not the thunderclap Alara might have once imagined. It was a quiet and settling event that left a vacuum in its wake. High on the canyon rim, Coda fired a single, blunt-tipped arrow into the sky, a signal. It was assigned to Major Covington, who was waiting with a small detachment a mile away, that the duel was over and the terms had been met. Alara was still kneeling by her father's grave when the soldiers, led by Covington, rode cautiously into the canyon. Covington was an older man, a career soldier with weary eyes who had clearly disliked Thorne's obsessive brutality. He dismounted and approached Alara not as a captor, but with a quiet, respectful gravity. He looked at Thorne's body, then at the woman whose life had been so brutally intertwined with his. "It's done," then, Covington said. It was not a question. Alara rose slowly to her feet, her face stained with the dust and tears of a decade of grief. She was exhausted, empty, but she stood tall. "It is. By the terms of your agreement," Covington continued, his voice formal, "your war is over. The bounties on your companions will be rescinded. You have my word that the hunt is ended." He paused, his gaze softening slightly. "What will you do now?" "Live," Alara said, the word feeling foreign on her tongue. "I'm going to try to live." She did not wait for a reply. She walked to her horse, mounted, and without a backward glance at the soldiers, at Thorne's body, or at the ghosts of her past, she rode out of Vance's Folly for the last time. Coda melted from the rocks and joined her, the two of them riding in a comfortable, familiar silence. They met Grizz at a prearranged rendezvous point, a small, hidden spring in the foothills. The old gunslinger's face was a mask of relief when he saw her. He didn't ask what happened. He could see it in the profound weariness of her eyes. The fire was gone. Finn and his sister are on a stagecoach to California, Grizz told her. They're safe. They're free. The words resonated with Alara. Safe. Free. They were concepts she had almost forgotten. For the first time, she had no list, no target, nowhere to plan. The future was a vast, terrifying, and utterly blank canvas. She came to a crossroads, both literally and figuratively. One path led east, back to the lawless territories and the life she knew. The other led west, toward California, toward the promise of a new start, toward the ocean she had only ever heard about in stories. "What now, Ellie girl?" Grizz asked gently. Alara looked down at her father's Colt, still holstered at her hip. It felt impossibly heavy, a weight of blood and memory. She had fought for 10 years to reclaim her father's legacy, but now she realized that her father's true legacy was not the gun, or the outlaw's reputation, or the vengeance she had sought in his name. It was the lessons he had taught her by the fire, the love of words, the belief that a person could be the ruler of their own kingdom, however small. Her vengeance had not brought him back. It had only chained her to his grave. To truly honor him, she had to live. With a resolve that surprised even herself, she unbuckled the gun belt, the one she had worn every day for 10 years. She handed it to Grizz. "I want you to have this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It belongs to the past. It belongs with you." Grizz took the heavy belt, his expression a mixture of shock and deep, sad understanding. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," she said. "I'm not the outlaw's daughter anymore, Grizz. I'm just Alara." She turned to Coda. "Will you ride with me, my friend, to see what's on the other side of the mountains?" The silent Apache tracker, who had stood by her through the darkest of times, simply nodded, a rare, small smile touching his lips. Grizz watched them go, to figures riding west toward the setting sun. He stood there for a long time, holding the legendary Colt, a relic of a bloody and bygone era. He knew he would never see her again. Alara Vance was never heard from again in the Arizona territory. The legend of the outlaw's daughter, however, lived on. It became a campfire story, a cautionary tale, a myth whispered on the wind. Some said she died in that final gunfight, her ghost still haunting the Cimarron. Others said she became a queen of the outlaws in Mexico. But the truth was quieter, and far more hopeful. She and Coda made it to the Pacific, and for the first time in her life, Alara saw an expanse so vast it made the deserts of her youth seem small. In a quiet coastal valley, she finally found a measure of the peace that had been stolen from her. She never touched a gun again. She built a small ranch, not a fortress like Vance's folly, but a simple, open home. She had found that the greatest act of defiance against a world that had tried to destroy her was not to kill, not to hate, but simply to endure, to heal, and to live. The echo of gunfire faded, replaced by the gentle roar of the ocean, the whisper of a new and peaceful wind.